Gracious God, we pray that you send your Spirit so these ancient words might become your living word and our lives might become your living witnesses. To this end, may the words of my mouth and the meditations of each one of our hearts be acceptable in your sight, O God, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. So we are finishing up a 3-week conversation about living bread. And I'm sure you're looking forward to it as much as the Bible study was on Wednesday and as much as I was. And I think and I hope that by the time we finish today's passage and sermon that we might have a better sense of what all this conversation about bread from heaven and drinking blood and eating flesh is all about. So we're in the 6th chapter of the Gospel of John, and I'm going to be reading from verse 56 to 69. Let us listen for what the Spirit may just be saying to the church. Jesus speaks. Those who eat my flesh and drink my blood abide in me and I in them. Just as the living Father has sent me, I live because of the Father. So whoever eats me will live because of me. This is the bread that came down from heaven, not like that which your ancestors ate and they died. But the one who eats this bread will live forever. He said these things while he was teaching in the synagogue at Capernaum. When many of his disciples heard it, they said, "This teaching is difficult. Who can accept it?" But Jesus, being aware that his disciples were complaining about it, said to them, "Does this offend you? And then what if you were to see the Son of Man ascending to where he was before? It is the Spirit that gives life. The flesh is useless. The words that I have spoken to you are spirit and life. But among you there are some who do not believe." For Jesus knew from the first who were the ones who did not believe and who were the ones that would betray him. And he said, "For this reason I have told you that no one can come to me unless it is granted by the Father." Because of this, many of his disciples turned back and no longer went about with him. So Jesus asked the 12, "Do you also wish to go away?" Simon Peter answered him, "Lord, to whom can we go? You have the words of eternal life. We have come to believe and know that you are the Holy One of God." This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. This is one of those passages which I always find fascinating when it comes to the life of the church. This teaching is difficult. Who can accept it? Jesus has been busy over these past few passages stirring up trouble. And in an era where we practically beg people to join churches, do anything, any gimmick we can come up with, we do, Jesus is willing to drive them away. Which leads me to think, why in the world is he doing that? And I'm convinced that this whole scene really is about the fact that the disciples, frankly the disciples of all ages, imaginations are held captive. We can only imagine that the world works a certain way. The stuff we grew up understanding and knowing, we come to take for granted. And so in order to overcome those hardened places in our minds and our hearts, Jesus sometimes has to shake us up. If you think about the moments in your own lives where you have found a new understanding of the world, most of the time, I would bet, didn't come just through a nice, gentle conversation. But you were jarred, difficult, moved to go, now wait a minute, and then you had to reevaluate. And this is what I think Jesus is doing. We have to be shaken to the point of being uncomfortable to imagine that what we assume is always the way things are may not just be the way things are. Sometimes, though, it does come through silent witnesses, and other times it comes through massive disruption of our lives. Look at the outrage that was caused when people say the words, "Black Lives Matter." All of a sudden, firestorms start erupting. Why don't they protest when they shoot their own people? You might have heard that. Well, why don't all lives matter? The outrage erupted, I believe, because people in general don't want to face the horrible reality that historically black and brown lives simply do not matter as much as white, particularly white wealthy males. The statistics are undeniable. So by pointing it out and watching the outrage, we find out that folks would rather live in willful ignorance of the facts. So Jesus comes along and says, I am the bread of life. Now to us that sounds like, well, that's great. I don't really understand it, but we should probably have communion or something. It sounds nice, but we don't fully understand what it means until we begin to scratch the surface. When Jesus first spoke these words, they were actually pretty offensive because he was equating himself with God. I am. As soon as Jesus says that in the Gospel of John, people start going, now wait a minute, that reminds me of something. That might have been Moses on the mountain. Moses asking, what is your name, God? And God says, well, I'm not going to give it to you, but something along the lines of I am. Sound familiar? But Jesus doesn't just stop with the I am statements. He says, I am the bread of heaven that has come down. I am the new man. So people are starting to get undone. You can't believe Jesus would take these foundational statements of the faith. And by the way, when the gospel says the Jews, they were all Jewish, so was Jesus. So it wasn't just Jewish people, it was all of the followers. They just had a different interpretation of what was going on. So he pushes even further. How can you do this? So Jesus equates his very presence when the coming day that God will bring death and injustice to the end. I am the new man coming down from heaven. That's what that story is all about. But finally, in our passage this morning, Jesus gets to the bridge that is just too far. Eat my flesh and drink my blood. You read over that a few times, and frankly, it sounds like we're being asked to become part of his vampire pod. If you read it again slowly, that's exactly what it sounds like. But what he's doing is now trying to invite people to break all the dietary laws regarding eating raw flesh and flesh with its blood in it, both an abomination before the Lord and the law. And this is just too much. But Jesus has to get people shaken out of their hard and fast understanding. So a group of disciples come to him in good church style and say, Jesus, we think you ought to know that there's some people unhappy. Not us, of course, but some people have said. Maybe that doesn't happen in your church. Instead of backing down and doing damage control or changing his message, Jesus stays the course. And as expected, many of the disciples walk away. I have read some versions of the gospel in various translations saying that this disaffected group of followers have abandoned Jesus. I'm thankful that our interpretation does not say that, because the Greek does not say that. In fact, what it says is all they don't do is they just don't walk around with him anymore. They are still disciples. They still, on some level, have the door open to them, but they're just no longer walking around. They don't want to be seen with him anymore. And so Jesus doesn't condemn them when they walk away. He doesn't say that they're not part of the faithful. He does not chastise them at all in this passage. What he says is he leaves the door open for their return. And that is really powerful. He doesn't change his message. He just says, okay, come and be part if you can, and if you can't, well, the door's still open if you change your mind. The door is never closed when it comes to following Jesus unless we close it and walk away. But even when we walk away, when we finally had a glimpse of the world that could be different, that things don't have to be this way, we will never be the same again. We'll always be annoyed. In the back of our minds, we can never go back. And that's the crazy thing about grace. Jesus knows that once we've gotten this radical glimpse of God's grace, there really is no going back. Once our minds have been opened to a new way of seeing the world, things will never be the same. Or as someone said, when you finally get grace, you will be ruined too. One of the things I find curious about Jesus' comments here is that in the same breath where he says, you must eat my flesh and drink my blood, he he comes back and says flesh is useless. Did you catch that contradiction? That's an important one. So he's not only being offensive, he's now talking in circles. Which leads me to ask, is he contradicting himself? Well, the simple answer is always no, because after all, Jesus is perfect, and he could never be wrong. So that's the answer, regardless of the question. Right? That's how we work things. You know, that's the churchy answer. Have you ever heard the old story of a Sunday school teacher? Had a group of kids, and they kept responding to 3 right answers, right? God, Jesus, Bible, Holy Spirit. Those are the answers, right? Didn't matter what the question was, throw those out, and this group of 3rd graders would always get the answer right. And the teacher knew this. On some level, as good educators, you know when your students are just parroting and when they really haven't internalized something. And so finally, this educator gets really undone and says, okay, what's brown and furry and runs to the forest? 2 or 3 times she asked the question, finally, oh, come on, you know what this is. And a sheepish child in the back row goes, the answer is Jesus, but it really sounds like a squirrel. So is Jesus contradicting himself? The answer is no, but not because we knee-jerk, churchy kinds of answer, no. But he is actually contradicting himself so that we ask the question, why? The answer, I believe, is found in when Peter speaks to Jesus, turns to him, and when they ask him, are you going to leave too? Peter's response to Jesus is a strange response. He says, to whom shall we go? And it seems odd to me. I would think it seems more normal for them to say, where shall we go? But it is in the whom that I think we get our answer around this. Is flesh good or is it bad? And what's he talking about? When Jesus talks about flesh being useless, what he's really talking about is clan or family or loyalty or people. If you've ever lived in the southeast United States, people go, who are your people? Right? When the disciples are offended and they go away, the truth is they believe at this point they have other options. They can go home to their family, to their clan, to their tribe, to their people. They can leave this Jesus movement behind. But when things get tough, they decide to pull up stakes and go back to their own people. You see, Jesus invites all of us, regardless of circumstance, race, gender, sexual orientation, class, or high school, to live and to be part of the same family. A new race, group of people where the dividing walls of hostility no longer have primary sway. Now, we know that that's difficult, but at least that's the message. And the 12 know this so well that when offered the opportunity to go away, they say, we can't go back. Now that we've seen this, they know they have a new loyalty in Jesus' flesh. And the flesh that's weak is all of those other identities in our lives. The other disciples who walk away don't get it, at least not yet. Because my guess is when they go back home and they start seeing the way things are, they might just decide to come back. Jesus leaves the door open. So that brings me to last Thursday morning, thinking about people and clan and race. Some of you might be familiar with what happened last Wednesday afternoon and evening, just a few blocks from here. There was a shooting of another 18-year-old young black man, and the stories of his death are contradictory, and folks got so mad that there ended up being fires and meetings, and it was a mess. So Thursday morning, I walked into the gym where I've been a member for 10 years and a regular attender throughout that time. I've come to know a number of the folks who work out there, at least on a surface level. The center where I work out is a really racially diverse community center. It's not a panacea of racial harmony, but there are regular people who have come to talk and to chat about the things of the world who, frankly, anywhere else wouldn't be with one another. They may not be best friends, but they do often talk about the world. They encourage one another. Their age differences don't matter, so you could be, 80 years old and people are impressed that you're bothering to lift at all. But on this past Thursday, something happened. When I saw a regular fellow who oftentimes will initiate conversation, he wasn't looking at me, he wouldn't look up, and I bothered to get in sort of into his face and say, "Good morning," which usually leads to a long conversation about sports or the world or whatnot, and all I got was a grunt and a nod, and he turned his back. What happened next really didn't surprise me all that much. It's not the first time that this kind of thing's happened. That morning, most of the black folk, most of the white folk kind of kept to themselves. I turned up my headphones rather loud and did my own thing. But after a while, and I wasn't noticing this until I heard a little bit of a ruckus, that I was the only white person in the room. And that is when I heard, and I reached down and I turned my headphones down. I heard anger, and I heard frustration. I heard one man say it's time for us to kidnap some police officers who put the fear of God in them, to terrorize their families, and some other things that I will not share. And earlier that morning, there was another fellow who also works out there, who's a white police officer, but doesn't tell anybody that that's his job. He said to me quietly, because we often talk when no one's around, "I'm terrified my family will be a target, so please don't ever, ever tell anybody what I do." People were tense on that day and struggling. And it's not just been that day, it's been a really rough year, frankly, in there. You see, the truth of the matter is, despite us seeing one another on a regular basis 3 or 4 times a week, despite being in that place, really the only thing that holds us together is that iron, and it's not strong enough to build a new clan or family. And while there has been the ability to break down the dividing walls of hostility in some interesting ways in that room, the truth is flesh, at the end of the day, like this, is worthless. I'm never leaving that place, and I recognize that there's some work to do, and we'll have to figure out how to deal with that place, because it is in some ways a strange but important place in our community. But I have seen this cycle before, where people decide when things get tough to kind of go into their own corners and to hang out with their own kind. Now, it would be easy at this point to say something about the fact that, well, we're different because we have unity in Jesus Christ. That flesh that we cling to is just a little bit different than the struggles around us. That we are a racially diverse worshiping community and we can stand above such things, but we need to be careful on that. Because the truth is, in reflection, that I have noticed some strange things in the last year. We struggled with what to say to one another on some days. Have you noticed it? In the days following Mike Brown's death, it seemed like we didn't want to talk about anything other than the weather. And the civil unrest led to some odd silences and even strained talk. And at the time, I really couldn't understand, or name it, but I could feel it in my bones, couldn't you? And then I realized something when I was standing in that weight room last night. Sharing his anger, he didn't care that I was there or anybody else might have come through. And I thought, maybe the church could learn from this experience. Here's what I mean. Because when troubles took to our streets, we got extra nice with one another. Maybe, just maybe, like folks in the weight room can learn from us, we can learn from them. What I mean is, what if we provided a place where rage and anger and tears, without worrying of getting tossed out or losing a friendship, could be real? Because it isn't the first time I've heard this style of rage. Not quite like this. But it's not the first time in my presence to do this. You don't want to talk to me, but in a couple of weeks we'll be talking again. Now think about that for a moment. If we move beyond the difficulty of being nice to being able to share the places of our deepest anger. Now think for a moment. Now, I didn't grow up in a family where we knew how to share anger very well, so it's something that's very difficult, right? And maybe some of you know that experience. But think about the people with whom you are able to share your deepest anger and frustration and pain. And those folks are pretty close to you, right? In fact, if we're not careful, we beat up on the people close to us verbally. All we do is we dump that stuff because that's the place where we dump it. But think for a moment that this became a place where we could begin to share. Now we do that. It's not that we don't at all. That this last year has been really difficult. Right? It's okay to say yes. But the truth of the matter is the flesh at the end of the day is useless. And our unity in Jesus Christ can be tenuous. There are days when the disciples want to walk off because they need some time. But the door is always open to come back, to share, to know that you could, in fact, say, you know what, I'm really angry about this. Or, you hurt me. When you said that, I can't be nice right now. I love you, but you need to know. That's the deep stuff right there. That's where healing could really happen. So when trouble comes to our place, and our town, and our streets, we can be like those disciples who go back to our own clan. But the truth is, the real truth of the gospel is you can never go back. It will never feel the same. Once you have seen that the dividing walls of hostility can be overcome, at least glimpses of it, you want to go back to that space. Once you've found a place where you can share intimacy on a strange level with people who are supposed to be your enemies, how can you go back? James and John and Matthew, they're my three favorite disciples, and I tell this story regularly because it's that important. James and John were the sons of Zebedee, and they were also known as the sons of thunder, and they were known as part of the Zealots. The Zealots were the folks who said, we've got to overcome the Roman occupation with violence, because it's the only thing they understand. We're going to fight back. We're going to find them, we're going to kidnap them, and we're going to terrorize their families. Somewhere in the text, I think. And then there was Matthew. Matthew was a tax collector. This was a guy who got rich on the backs of his own people. We've heard something about that in the way that the North County courts are set up. Now, we know it's going on elsewhere, but at least it's gotten publicized there. And these folks were at the same table with Jesus and had given up those ways, recognizing that a new family was possible, a new way was possible. This is what we mess with when we're playing with the gospel. It is possible for us this time to do the same kinds of things. It will take baby steps. But if we don't really have any other choice, unless we decide to walk off. But then we are finally left with two questions. To whom shall we go? And this teaching is difficult. Who can accept it? Amen.